The Portuguese Restoration War was the name given by 19th-century Romantic historians to the war between Portugal and Spain that began with the Portuguese Revolution of 1640 and ended with the Treaty of Lisbon in 1668. The Revolution of 1640 ended the 60-year rule of Portugal by the Spanish Habsburgs. The period from 1640 to 1668 was marked by periodic skirmishes between Portugal and Spain, as well as short episodes of more serious warfare, much of it occasioned by Spanish and Portuguese entanglements with non-Iberian powers. Spain was involved in the 30 Years' War until 1648 and the Franco-Spanish War until 1659, while Portugal was involved in the Dutch Portuguese War until 1663. In the 17th century and afterwards, this period of sporadic conflict was simply known, in Portugal and elsewhere, as the Acclamation War. The war established the House of Braganza as Portugal's new ruling dynasty, replacing the House of Habsburg. This ended the so-called Iberian Union, events leading to revolution. When Philip II of Portugal died, he was succeeded by Philip III, who had a different approach to Portuguese issues. Taxes on the Portuguese merchants were raised, the Portuguese nobility began to lose its influence at the Spanish Cortes, and government posts in Portugal were increasingly occupied by Spaniards. Ultimately, Philip III tried to make Portugal a Spanish province, and Portuguese nobles stood to lose all of the power. This situation culminated in a revolution organized by the nobility and bourgeoisie, executed on the 1st of December 1640, 60 years after the crowning of Philip I, the first dual monarch. The plot was planned by Antão Vaz de Almada, Miguel de Almeida, and João Pinto Ribeiro. They, together with several associates, known as the 40 conspirators, killed the Secretary of State, Miguel de Vasconcelos, and imprisoned the king's cousin, Margaret of Savoy, who had been governing Portugal in his name. The moment was well chosen. Philip's troops were, at the time, fighting the 30 Years' War and also facing a revolution in Catalonia which became known as the Reapers' War. The support of the people became apparent almost immediately, and, within a matter of hours, John, 8th Duke of Braganza was acclaimed as King John IV of Portugal. The news spread like wildfire throughout the country. By the 2nd of December 1640, the day following the coup, John IV, acting in his capacity as sovereign of the country, had already sent a letter to the municipal chamber of Évora. The ensuing conflict with Spain brought Portugal into the 30 Years' War as at least a peripheral player. From 1641 to 1668, the period during which the two nations were at war, Spain sought to isolate Portugal militarily and diplomatically, and Portugal tried to find the resources to maintain its independence through political alliances and maintenance of its colonial income. Preparations for war. Immediately after assuming the Portuguese throne, João IV took several steps to strengthen his position. On the 11th of December 1640, a Council of War was created to organize all of the operations. Next, the king created the Junta of the Frontiers to take care of the fortresses near the border, the hypothetical defense of Lisbon, and the garrisons and seaports. A year later, in December 1641, he created a tendency to assure that all of the country's fortresses would be upgraded and that the improvements would be financed with regional taxes. João IV also organized the army, re-established the military laws of King Sebastian, and undertook a diplomatic campaign focused on restoring good relations with England. After gaining several small victories, João tried to make peace quickly. However, his demand that Philip recognize the new ruling dynasty in Portugal was not fulfilled until the reign of his son, Afonso VI. During the regency of Peter of Braganza, confrontations with Spain lasted 28 years. Context: relations among the European powers. Relations between France and Spain. In 1640, Cardinal Richelieu, the chief advisor to Louis XIII of France, was fully aware of the fact that France was operating under strained circumstances. He was at war with Spain at the time. He had to control rebellions within France that were supported and financed by Madrid, and he had to send French armies to fight the Spanish Habsburgs on 3 different fronts. In addition to the shared frontier at the Pyrenees, Philip IV of Spain, formerly Philip III of Portugal as well, reigned under various titles in Flanders and Franche-Comté to the north and east of France. In addition, Philip IV controlled large territories in Italy, where he could, at will, impose a fourth front by attacking French-controlled Savoy. Spain had enjoyed a reputation as having the most formidable military force in Europe, a reputation they had gained with the introduction of the arquebus and the so-called Spanish school. This reputation and tactic had, however, diminished with the 30 Years' War. Nevertheless, the consummate statesman, Richelieu, decided to force Philip IV to look to his own internal problems. In order to divert the Spanish troops besieging France, Louis XIII, on the advice of Richelieu, supported the claim of João IV of Portugal during the Acclamation War. This was done on the reasoning that a Portuguese war would drain Spanish resources and manpower. Relations between Portugal and France. To fulfill the common foreign policy interests of Portugal and France, a treaty of alliance between the two countries was concluded at Paris on 1 June 1641. It lasted 18 years before Richelieu's successor as unofficial foreign minister, Cardinal Mazarin, broke the treaty and abandoned his Portuguese and Catalan allies to sign a separate peace with Madrid. The Treaty of the Pyrenees was signed in 1659, under the terms of which France received the portion of Catalonia north of the Pyrenees, known as the Roussillon, and part of the Cerdagne. Most important to the Portuguese, the French recognized Philip IV of Spain as the legitimate king of Portugal. 7 years later, in the late stages of the Portuguese Restoration War, relations between the two countries thawed to the extent that the young Afonso VI of Portugal married a French princess, Marie-Françoise of Nemours. Relations between Portugal and the Dutch Republic at the time of the revolution in Lisbon. The Portuguese had been at war with the Dutch for nearly 40 years. A good deal of the conflict can be attributed to the fact that Spain and the Dutch Republic were concurrently engaged in the 80 Years' War, and, ever since hostilities between Portugal and the Dutch Republic erupted in 1602, Portugal had been ruled by a Spanish monarch. The Dutch-Portuguese War was fought almost entirely overseas, with the Dutch mercantile surrogates, the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company, repeatedly attacking Portugal's colonial possessions in the Americas, in Africa, in India, and in the Far East. Portugal was in a defensive posture throughout, and it received very little military help from Spain. After the acclamation of João IV, this pattern persisted all over the Portuguese Empire until the final expulsion of the Dutch from Angola, São Tomé, and Brazil. The Dutch signed a European truce with Portugal, helping each other somewhat against their common enemy, Spain. The Dutch resumed buying salt in the Setúbal salt factories, restarting commerce between the two countries for the first time since 1580, when the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs, against whom the Dutch were in revolt, had assumed the Portuguese throne. However, Dutch attacks on Portuguese territories persisted until 1663, even after the signing of the Treaty of The Hague in 1661. Relations between Portugal and England. England was, at this time, embroiled in its own civil war. Portuguese problems in dealing with England arose from the fact that the English Parliament fought and won its anti-royalist war while, at the same time, Portugal's royal court continued to receive and recognize English princes and nobles. These strained relations persisted during the short-lived Commonwealth period, when the Republican government that had deposed Charles I ruled England and then Ireland and Scotland. After the restoration of the Stuart dynasty, it became possible for Portugal to compensate for the loss of limited French support by renewing its traditional alliance with England. This took the form of a dynastic marriage between Charles II and Afonso VI's sister, Catherine of Braganza, which assured Portugal of outside support in its conflict with Spain. It was largely due to the English alliance that peace with Spain became possible at war's end. Spain had been drained by the 30 Years' War, and it had no stomach for further warfare with other European powers, especially a resurgent England. The war. Militarily, the Portuguese Restoration War consisted mainly of border skirmishes and cavalry raids to sack border towns, combined with occasional invasions and counter-invasions, many of them half-hearted and under-financed. There were only 5 major set-piece battles during 28 years of hostilities. The war may be considered to have had 3 periods. First, an early stage when a few major engagements demonstrated that the Portuguese could not be easily returned to submission to the Spanish Habsburgs. Second, a long period of military standoffs, characterized by small-scale raiding, while Spain concentrated on its military commitments elsewhere in Europe. Third, a final period during which the Spanish king, Philip IV, unsuccessfully sought a decisive victory that would bring an end to hostilities. The first stage, skirmishes. Hoping for a quick victory in Portugal, Spain immediately committed 7 regiments to the Portuguese frontier, but delays by the Count of Monterrey, a commander with more interest in the comforts of life at camp than the battlefield, squandered any immediate advantage. A Portuguese counter-thrust in late 1641 failed, and the conflict soon settled into a stalemate. The Battle of Monte Joe. On the 26th of May 1644, a large column of Spanish troops and mercenaries, commanded by the Neapolitan Marquis of Torrecusa, was stopped at the Battle of Monte Joe by the Portuguese, who were led by the Marechal Albuquerque, one of a number of experienced Portuguese colonial officers who rose to prominence during the war. The Siege of Elvas. Shortly thereafter, in November 1644, Torrecusa crossed from Badajoz, in a rare winter campaign, to attack the Portuguese town of Elvas, which he besieged for 9 days. He suffered heavy losses and was forced back across the border. Atrocities. The war now took on a peculiar character. It became a frontier confrontation, often between local forces, neighbors who knew each other well. But this familiarity did not moderate the destructive and bloodthirsty impulses of either side. The wanton nature of the combat was often exacerbated by the use of mercenaries and foreign conscripts. Incidents of singular cruelty were reported. On both sides, the Portuguese settled old animosities that had festered during 60 years of Spanish domination, and the Spanish often took the view that their opponents were disloyal and rebellious subjects, not an opposing army entitled to respectful treatment under the rules of combat. Scope of the war: 3 theaters of warfare were eventually opened, but most activity focused on the northern front, near Galicia, and on the central frontier, between Portuguese Alentejo and Spanish Extremadura. The southern front, where the Portuguese Algarve abuts Spanish Andalusia, was a logical target for Portugal, but it was never the focus of a Portuguese attack, probably because the Portuguese Queen, Luisa de Guzman, was the sister of the Duke of Medina Sidonia, the leading noble of Andalusia. Attrition and corruption. Spain, at first, made the war a defensive one. Portugal, for its part, felt no need to take Spanish territory in order to win, and it too was willing to make the war a defensive contest. Campaigns typically consisted of correries to burn fields, sack towns, and steal large herds of enemy cattle and sheep. Soldiers and officers, many of them mercenaries, were primarily interested in booty and prone to desertion. For long periods, without men or money, neither side mounted formal campaigns, and when actions were taken, they were often driven as much by political considerations, such as Portugal's need to impress potential allies, as by clear military objectives. Year after year, given the problems of campaigning in the winter, and the heat and dry conditions of summer, most of the serious fighting was confined to 2 relatively short campaign seasons in the spring and fall. The war settled into a pattern of mutual destruction. As early as December 1641, it was common to hear Spaniards throughout the country lament that Extremadura is finished. Tax collectors, recruiting officers, billeted soldiers, and depredations by Spanish and foreign troops were loathed and feared by the Spanish population as much as raids by the enemy. In Extremadura, local militias bore the brunt of the fighting until 1659, and the absence of these part-time soldiers was extremely harmful to agriculture and local finances. Since there was often no money to pay or support the troops, the Spanish crown turned a blind eye to the smuggling, contraband, profiteering, disorder, and destruction that had become rampant on the frontier. Similar conditions also existed among the Portuguese. The second stage, defensive standoff. The war was also expensive. In the 1650s, there were over 20,000 Spanish troops in Extremadura alone, compared to 27,000 in Flanders. Between 1649 and 1654, about 29% of Spanish defense spending was appropriated for fighting Portugal, a figure that rose during the major campaigns of the 1660s. Portugal was able to finance its war effort because of its ability to tax the spice trade with Asia and the sugar trade from Brazil, and it received some support from the European opponents of Spain, particularly France and England. The 1650s were indecisive militarily but important on the political and diplomatic fronts. The death of João IV in 1656 signaled the beginning of the regency of his wife, followed by a succession crisis and a palace coup. Despite these domestic problems, the expulsion of the Dutch from Brazil and the signing of a treaty with England improved Portugal's diplomatic and financial position temporarily, and gave it needed protection against a naval raid on Lisbon. Nonetheless, the overriding goal, a formal pact with France, continued to evade Portugal, whose weakness and isolation had been driven home by its virtual exclusion at the negotiations for the European settlement of settlements. The new realpolitik of the Peace of Westphalia. With this treaty and the end of hostilities in Catalonia in 1652, Spain was again ready to direct its efforts against Portugal, but it faced a lack of men, resources, and, especially, good military commanders. The third stage, Portuguese victory. By 1662, Spain had committed itself to a major effort to end the war. John of Austria the Younger, Philip IV's illegitimate son, led 14,000 men into Alentejo, and, the following year, they succeeded in taking Évora, the major city of the region. The Portuguese, under Antonio Luis de Meneses, first Marquis of Marialva, and the German soldier of fortune, Friedrich Hermann von Schönberg, Count of Mettola, who had been contracted, along with other foreign officers and over 2,000 English troops, were able to turn the tide. They defeated the Spanish in a major engagement at Amixil on 8 June 1663, and this forced John of Austria to abandon Évora and retreat across the border with heavy losses. The Portuguese now had some 30,000 troops in the Alentejo Extremadura theatre, but they could not draw the Spanish again into a major engagement until June 1665, when a new Spanish commander, the Marquis of Caracena, took over Villavicosa with about 23,000 men, including recruits from Germany and Italy. The Portuguese relief column under Antonio Luis de Meneses and Schomberg met them at Montes Claros on 17 June 1665. The Portuguese infantry and gun emplacements broke the Spanish cavalry, and the Spanish force lost over 10,000 men, including casualties and prisoners. Shortly thereafter, the Portuguese retook Villavicosa. These were the last major engagements of the war. Both sides returned to skirmishing campaigns. Portugal, with the intercession of its English ally, had sought a truce, but after the decisive Portuguese victory at Montes Claros and with the signing of a Franco-Portuguese treaty in 1667, the Spanish Habsburgs finally agreed to recognize the House of Braganza as Portugal's new ruling dynasty on 13 February 1668. Recapitulation. The five major battles of the war were: Battle of Monte Joe on 26 May 1644, Battle of the Lines of Elvas on 14 January 1659, Battle of Amixil on 8 June 1663, Battle of Castelo Rodrigo on 7 July 1664, Battle of Montes Claros on 17 June 1665. The Portuguese were victorious in almost all of these engagements, and peace was concluded, with the help of English mediation, by the Treaty of Lisbon in 1668.